200 guests. One spoon tapping a champagne flute. One diamond earring arcing through the air and landing on polished marble like an exclamation point. They thought I was the family failure. They thought the house, my house, was an easy thing to take away. They thought a wedding podium was the right stage for conversion therapy, turning my independence into a gift for someone else. They were wrong. If you like stories about standing your ground, hit like and subscribe. This one is worth sitting through. I remember the sound before anything else. The hollow clink of silver against glass, that polite ceremonial rhythm people use when they want attention without admitting they want attention. The ballroom had mirrored walls that night, a dozen chandeliers, a runway of polished wood, and the long head table where every relative who'd ever noticed me pretended to be surprised I existed. My sister, Sophia, looked impossibly luminous in layers of tulle and lace. She glanced at me with the small, private smile she'd perfected for the camera. Behind her, Brian, the groom, laughing the way men laugh when they know their phone's live stream is already getting viewers. Someone tapped their spoon. The murmuring quieted. Aunt Patricia leaned forward like a juror about to deliver a verdict. And then my mother, Carol, cleared her throat and said the words I'd rehearsed 1,000 ways in my head, but never for the reality of that ballroom. Sophia and Brian have a gift, she declared. Madison's penthouse will now belong to our daughter. The room exhaled as one. Glass clinked, resumed. Some guests laughed, nervous, delighted, the laughter that feeds on spectacle. My penthouse was a $2 million thing in a city that's kinder to ambition than to family expectations. I had bought it with my own salary, with late-night flights and grueling deals, and an offer accepted after an arduous negotiation where I refused to sell on price alone. I had fought for that view of the river, for the floor-to-ceiling windows that held entire sunrises, for the single corner that belonged only to me. For my family, it was now a prop. It was classic. The family narrative had long been set. Sophia, the golden child, deserved the reward. I, the so-called disappointment, would be publicly rebuked, humiliated, sent home with my dignity tucked into a box so that the optics of unity could be preserved. They thought the wedding would make me fold. I didn't fold. I reached for my earring before my mind even registered the decision. You can't, I said, loud enough for the microphones to catch it, lower than the amused clatter in the room, but steady, precise. I bought that penthouse. It's mine. There are moments when being calm is the most disarming thing you can do. People expect a dramatic collapse from the failed daughter archetype, a sob, a plea, theatrics. They don't expect a succinct denial. My voice skimmed the mirrored walls and landed on faces. Some looked as if I'd just interrupted a play. Some were delighted. They loved an edge to the story now. My mother smiled in a way that looked like a practiced tilt for photographs, and moved her hand as if to tuck me back into the role they'd assigned. Madison, she said, with that mixture of sweetness and steel. This isn't the time. This is exactly the time, I answered. The train of events that followed lasted maybe 10 seconds in real time and stretched into a slow-motion film in my head where the soundtrack turned to absolute silence. My mother stepped forward. Her hand came up, not the slap of a playful aunt correcting hair, but the harsh beveled strike of someone intending harm. It landed across my cheek with the slap's particular geometry. An audible whoosh, the split-second squeak of silk as it brushed skin, then a dull thud that echoed in the mirrors. For a moment there was nothing but the glitter of chandeliers and the flutter of camera lights. My earring left my ear and described a perfect little arc before hitting the floor, a tiny comet of light. Time returned in fragments. The room went quiet because the livestream had to register the shock. Someone shouted, "What the hell?" as if in disbelief at a country not yet willing to accept violence in public. My sister's mouth formed shapes that could have been words, or could have been horror. My father, Richard, who'd always had a way of pretending to be amused at my choices, sank into his chair with the look of someone who knew he had miscalculated the punchline for once. I remember kneeling because it was the only dignified motion left. I didn't drop. There was no melodrama, no stage collapse. I bent and picked up the earring, small and stubborn against the marble. The cold of the stone steadied me. I held it between my fingers like a verdict. People flurried. The room was suddenly a map of faces, cousins whispering into each other's ears. The doorman in a jacket who had watched this family for years, frozen halfway between duty and fascination. A stranger's phone already read with the live indicator. Someone had started the stream before the cake had been cut. Someone else had clicked record. I could feel the prickle of being captured in an unflattering, unfriendly light that would travel farther than any of us could imagine. My mother spoke again. "Madison, we're doing what is best for the family." There is a certain vocabulary families learn when they mean to control. Best, for the family, legacy, sacrifice, words that sound like morality but are really mechanisms of coercion. I had lived with that vocabulary since childhood. It was how my accomplishments became footnotes in a narrative that refused to see me. It was how my successes were reduced to not surprising, because I wasn't supposed to be the one who succeeded. I stood up. The ballroom felt suddenly too small for the decision I had to make. The people around us had been raised to expect spectacle. My standing up without pleading or hymns and haws stole the show from them. I took a breath and left the room without answering my mother's final, thinly veiled barbs. I didn't give them the satisfaction of an escalating scene. I didn't cry. I walked. Outside, the hallway smelled of roses and the hotel's expensive carpet. The doorman, James, who had seen me in suits and sweats and once held the door as I moved in a box labeled Madison Hayes, contents fragile, looked at me with something like pity wrapped in curiosity. He studied my cheek, the faint red bloom there, and then studied the way I held myself. "Ms. Hayes," he said quietly, "do you need—" "No," I said. "Just the street." I stood on the curb with my purse and the city breathing past me. I could have called a cab, or gone home to the penthouse and never come back to the family table. I could have sworn a private, brutal revenge in the confines of my head. But revenge isn't a plan. It's a private temperature that cools with time and leaves stains. I had a different sort of plan. Not revenge. Leverage. There are ways to be powerful that don't make you loud and cruel. There are legal contours and corporate realities, clauses tucked into documents, relationships between people with shares and votes, the quiet scaffolding of influence. I had spent years building competence, connections, and crucially, contingency. It was what people who are repeatedly dismissed learn to do. Build a private safety net out of contracts and alliances, not out of fantasies of knockdown fights. Marcus Chen answered on the second ring. "You have people in life who are catalysts." Marcus was that person for me. He'd been my mentor since my earliest job, the executive who saw the numbers I wasn't giving voice to and taught me how to present them. He'd encouraged me to take risks, to accept hard stretches in Asia-Pacific markets, to stay when it would have been simpler to leave. He also owned 40% of my father's company, not because of family connections, but because he'd been an early investor and a steady, shrewd partner. That stake, which might have seemed peripheral to outsiders, was the single lever that could stop a family narrative from turning into a corporate catastrophe. "Madison?" Marcus's voice was calm, the kind of calm that is dangerous because it suggests a mind already several moves ahead. "Where are you?" "Outside the Fairmont," I said. "They just announced my penthouse as a wedding gift." "Wait there." He didn't ask me what I wanted him to do. He simply said, "I'm on my way. Keep your phone on." This, more than anything else, is why contingency matters. It isn't the clause in a deed or the fraction of ownership that is glamorous. It's the understanding that structures exist for a reason, that people with institutional memory and leverage can make a nuisance into an account liability. Marcus understood how the world of shareholders and clients worked. He also understood optics. He knew that when a wedding live-streamed a woman being publicly humiliated, it didn't stay in the room. It bled into social feeds, into client inboxes, into newsrooms. He knew that boards don't like lawsuits or bad press. They like stability, clients, and shareholders who can point to something actionable. When people talk about power, they often think of trophies, money, property, positions. They ignore the other currency, the right phone number, the ally who will answer at midnight. Marcus was that currency. I had cultivated a relationship of mutual respect and clear boundaries with him. He'd offered mentorship without attempt to own. I'd accepted advice without expectation of charity. That was my secret project, the slow, unglamorous work of building alignment and armor that didn't announce itself until needed. I texted Sophia first. Her message came back almost instantly. 3 blue hearts and a selfie of her leaning on Brian's shoulder. Normal. Denial. Selective vision. I typed a short note to my father. We need to talk privately. I didn't send it. Instead, I called Marcus. He arrived before I expected him. This is another detail people don't often consider. Leverage isn't always about timing. Sometimes it's about presence. Marcus walked into the hotel's marble foyer with the sort of composed stride execs practice in airport lounges. He wore a gray wool coat and a face like someone who'd seen countenances and measured them quickly into categories. Ally, neutral, opponent. When he reached me, he didn't ask for the play-by-play. He simply folded his hand around mine and said, "Show me." We walked back into the ballroom like 2 people who had rehearsed being calm under duress. Cameras turned, whispers turned into a ripple when the livestream junkies noticed a new player. Marcus's presence was an anchor. He knew how to position himself in a room so that the narrative shifted subtly. Where he was, seriousness lived. He took my arm and guided me toward a place near the back where we could be on speaker without being the spectacle. I handed him the earring. "She hit me," I said. "My mother." Marcus's jaw tightened. Not in anger, but in calculation. He had the clerical manner of someone who knows the rules and who, when pushed, will enforce them with cold utility rather than melodrama. "Good," he said. "I need you to tell me exactly how the penthouse was titled, who was involved in the purchase, and whether there are any transfer documents." "This is important," he said, looking over his phone as if reading a set of wires that only he could see. "And if anyone attempts to coerce a transfer, the shareholders will view it as a hostile act. We can't promise outcomes, but it's actionable." He did not use the word hostage. No need. He described frameworks, client risk, shareholder reaction, reputational exposure. He spoke in the currency of boardrooms and balance sheets, but it felt less like jargon and more like armor. His phrases were leverage, immediate review, client exposure, terms that translate easily into consequences for people who depend on uninterrupted business. He wasn't threatening in the childish sense. He was enumerating the inevitable ripple effects that arise when personal conduct collides with professional exposure. I told him about the clause I had insisted on at closing. I didn't know the legal term for it. It was a seat of protection added when the solicitor was concerned about transfers under duress. Marcus didn't need the name. He nodded as if he'd expected precisely that kind of foresight. "We can amplify this," he said. "But it has to be precise. I'll make a call. Leave it with me." Leave it with me. There it was, the kind of covenant I had learned to build. A person who would respond, and a structural reality that made their response meaningful. Not justice as vengeance, but as a mechanism to restore a baseline of safety. When he dialed, he put the phone on speaker. People at nearby tables heard the low murmur of a conversation about shareholder obligations and client sensitivity. My mother's smile stiffened. My father glanced up, a man trying to measure the cost of his impulsive domestic theater against the ledger of his company. "I'm Marcus Chen," the voice said when it reached the other end. Marcus did not preface his introduction with friendship notes. "I'm calling about an incident involving Madison Hayes. This is not a personal request. There are material business risks arising from what was effectively coercion at a public event. I want to be clear about the potential consequences before anyone proceeds with any transfer of property or public statements." My mother, who had been buoyed by the audience moments before, glanced at Richard with panic cracking the practiced composure. The family tableau shifted. Cameras closed in again, hungry for the new angle. If there had been an audience for this narrative before, now the audience widened. Someone in the crowd, the groom's brother, a livestream host with a penchant for drama, panned his phone back to focus on the conversation. The red live dot glowed. The scene I had tried to avoid being the center of attention for was now the story, and stories travel. Marcus's words were careful but direct. "We are asking that no transfers be attempted or announced tonight. We will convene the board for a discussion. Clients should be briefed that this matter is being handled internally. If this escalates, it will have consequences that extend beyond family." He wasn't shouting. There was no threat of violence, no promise of ruin. He was doing what power does best, stating facts that translate into consequences without melodrama. The room, which had been a contest of emotional theater, now faced the sober language of business. The shift disoriented people who'd been fine with moral theater until moral theater met financial reality. My father came to the edge of the table, his face an expression I had seen many times. The man who had always believed he could manage optics by turning up charm. "Marcus," he said, voice wavering. "This isn't—" "Richard," Marcus interrupted calmly. "This is about exposure. Think about contract breaches, clients who might be concerned about governance. Think about investors. We're not litigating your family. We're protecting the company and our mutual interests." The word company was a lever that operated on people differently than family. There was the sudden, visible calculation in my father's eyes. The memory of board meetings, of financial statements, of client dinners. The smile he'd used to insulate himself from consequences faltered. Someone spectators joked under their breath, "Which side are you on?" But the joke landed flat. The seriousness returned. Phones recorded. The live stream picked up the speakerphone chorus, Marcus's voice, my mother's shaken explanations, my father's faltering defenses. The clip that would later be edited into frame-by-frame judgments was already being formed. I stood there, feeling neither triumph nor humiliation. The most private part of me, the part that had spent years learning to be invisible so I would not be trampled, was oddly quiet. What I felt instead was a recognition of the cost of visibility. Visibility doesn't exempt you from pain, but it does mean that your actions create ripples. Sometimes those ripples hit you where it hurts. Sometimes they wash your name out of the mud. As conversations heated, I made a choice. I didn't step back onto the stage to fight. I didn't scream for apologies. I let Marcus be the adult in the room who translated family drama into corporate risk, because his translation would have teeth. I left the ballroom again, this time toward the service elevator with a small private smile. The world could watch them scramble. I had something they didn't, a plan they hadn't accounted for, and the composure to let consequence do the work. Outside, behind the glass of the hotel's back alley, a dozen people smoking and texting clustered around the red light that meant live. A child about my sister's age, fidgeting with a parent's hand, looked up and asked in a voice unguarded by anything adult, "Why did she hit you?" The question landed with the bluntness of truth. "Because," I said, looking at my hand where the earring sat like a small, iridescent wound, "people sometimes think they own what you built. They forget that building takes work." Marcus joined me a few minutes later. "They're talking about reputational damage," he said, "and clients are getting nervous." "Leverage," I said. "Do it." He nodded. "We'll need to be careful. We can't promise legal outcomes, but we can make it clear that this is not something the board will ignore. People don't like uncertainty. They'll act to reduce it." The solution was not the spectacular sort. It was a sequence of modest, disciplined moves. A shareholder expressing concern, clients being briefed, a board meeting scheduled. None of it guaranteed a particular result, but all of it made the cost of my family's spectacle more than a private embarrassment. It turned it into an enterprise problem. "Also," Marcus said softer, with the kind of humor that wasn't quite humor, "I hope you don't actually expect me to let your mother get away with it." "Mr. Chen," I said, not smiling, "you can call me Madison." "Madison," he said. "I said the same to you the first time you convinced me not to write off a market in Jakarta. Glad to be convincing again." I had all too long conversations with myself about what it meant to be vindicated. I had imagined that vindication would feel like fireworks, immediate, explosive, publicly gratifying. Instead, vindication arrived as a series of paperwork motions, phone calls, and the slow, precise grinding of institutional mechanisms. There's a humility to it that is almost therapeutic, the knowledge that strength isn't always loud or swift. Sometimes it is a phone on speaker slow-rolling a problem toward resolution. We walked back into the ballroom together. The air-conditioned room smelled of lemon oil and celebration. People retreated to the edges like fish after a boat passes. My father met me at the steps, the expression on his face an old language of apology and calculation. He started, "Madison." "Not here," I said. "We will speak when you're prepared to have a conversation that isn't performative." He flinched, as if the word performative carried an electric shock. It did. He wasn't prepared for a conversation that might cost him. He had always relied on the family stage to do its work, smother conflict under the guise of ceremony and hope it didn't resurface. He was learning tonight that some things don't get smothered. Some things gain a different life when they're broadcast to strangers with screens. My mother, Carol, refused to meet my eye. Her posture was furious and practiced, the kind of righteousness that has protected abusive behavior for generations. Later, people would try to assign a label: remorseful, bitter, proud. In that moment, she looked like a woman who'd been denied the expected drama of her own narrative and needed to claw back the parts of her story she'd been promised by family allegiance. When the DJ tried to pick up the song where the program had left it, the band froze. The night had become a ledger. People checked their phones. The red dot blinked. Views ticked up. I didn't dance. I didn't laugh. I stepped outside onto the hotel terrace where the city opened like a promise. Far below, the river stole the lights of the city and turned them into something calmer than the room. I held the earring in my hand and thought of the months and years and deals that had put me there. I thought of the tiny practicalities, my mortgage statements, the maintenance payments, the calls with contractors for the terrace. It all felt both trivial and precious in equal measure. It was mine because I had made it mine, and that claim was not the same thing as the right to hurt others. Boundaries are not nails to drive in with spite. They are lines to be upheld so you can live untrammeled. When Marcus wrapped up his call, short, efficient, the sort of thing that leaves no doubt he will follow through, he leaned in and said, "Get someone who will cover you tonight. We'll convene the board tomorrow. The optics are ugly, but the facts are straightforward." "Will there be fallout?" I asked. "There will be consequences," he said. "I can't promise outcomes. I can promise we'll treat this as the kind of exposure that demands attention." Ambiguity is a friend of the guilty. Being precise about your limits is a friend of the wronged. I remember thinking then that my family's hubris had been to assume a private humiliation would stay private. They had misread the modern age. Weddings used to be the place where secrets were safe because they were ritualized. Now secrets on a stage become viral moments with contract implications and investor alarms and the sort of corporate white papers that translate into reputational pressure. The town they thought they could control, the words they expected to dictate over family wine and baked goods, was now a networked organism. My so-called secret project, the quiet scaffolding of professional relationships and legal foresight, had turned out to be the only thing big enough to change the conversation. We went back inside because reality isn't theater forever. Sometimes you have to return to the place and stand there while the world chooses to either believe or not. Cameras fed. The kitchen staff whispered. My sister saw me and mouthed an apology that was mostly surprise and a trace of guilt. Brian avoided eye contact, the way men do when they've watched a brother-in-law's joke turn sour. When Marcus sat down across from my father, he did not stand for theatrics. He explained plainly about exposure and client sensitivity and the cost of uncertainty. He told the room that there would be a measured, formal discussion at the board level, and that no transfers of property or public statements would be permitted until that conversation happened. Richard tried to appeal to charm and history. Marcus listened for 20 seconds, then said, "If we're going to protect the firm, we have to be factual. Personal feelings matter, but they do not override governance. We will treat this matter accordingly." The statement landed with a weight I hadn't felt in the family kitchen since the time my mother tried to reorganize my college acceptance letters as if they were family achievements. Authority, once applied, changes the tenor of a dispute. People who had been merrily conducting a ritual found themselves suddenly under the scrutiny of a different framework. As the meeting dissolved into awkward dinner conversation, I found a moment alone with James, the doorman, who had returned with a tray of water like a concerned aide. He looked at my cheek and then at me with something that was not pity exactly, but a recognition. "You handled yourself," he said. "Sometimes," I said, "the best response is to make sure the consequences are proportional." He nodded. People forget that. At some point in that night, somebody uploaded a clip. The 5-second segment, my mother's hand, the arc of my earring, the pause of the crowd, made its way through the internet with the mechanical impartiality of code. The red dot that had been blinking now grew eyes. Comments, shares, outraged remarks, defenses, invitations to choose sides. Viral attention is a democratic process of judgment. It amplifies what happens in a room and sets it against countless other rooms where similar injustices happen without consequence. I don't relish being showcased, but I recognize that visibility has a utility. It makes the private public in a way that demands accountability. The rest of the night was procedural. My sister stormed off at one point. She later texted me that she didn't want to be party to what she called a corporate witch hunt. I texted her back that no one had asked her consent to make me a prop either. She didn't reply. I slept poorly that night, not because of the slap itself, though my cheek throbbed with the memory, but because I had realized how thin a line there is between family theater and public exposure. The next morning, the clip had been replayed across feeds. People who didn't know me made judgments that would complicate our familial relationships. But it also meant the town, the network of clients, neighbors, school parents, co-workers, and social registers, had seen the violence in public. That mattered. The morning after, Marcus called a meeting. It was brief. He laid out a sequence of steps: board notification, client briefing, internal investigation. He described the procedural consequences in the language of risk mitigation. He also said something more human. We'll make sure you're safe. No public statements forcing transfer until we've had a measured conversation. Will this ruin them? I asked. It will create consequences, he said, and those consequences could include reputational damage and client concern. But we can't promise an outcome. We can make sure you are protected in the immediate term. There is an odd humility to such language. It reminds you that power is not absolute. It is contingent, relational. It requires allies. It requires patience. It requires restraint. It requires you to do what you are able, when you are able, and accept that the rest is uncertain. After the meeting, there was a small victory and a small humiliation. My father called a press contact he knew and tried to spin the story as a family misunderstanding. The contact, when he heard the outline, had enough sense to ask if the firm had been notified. The spin collapsed. The process became procedural. The board received notice. I sat in Marcus's office and watched a wall of windows through which the city looked like the kinds of things I had bought with patience and the hard work no one ever applauded at dinner. People will take sides, Marcus said. Some will question your motives. Some will support you. The important thing is, you defined your boundary, and you have allies. That matters. I thought of my mother, who had struck me and then gone about the rest of her evening with the untroubled air of someone convinced that family rituals are larger than consequences. I thought of Sophia, who had a decade of being adored by strangers and family alike. I thought of the penthouse, the small refuge of glass and light where I had listened to podcasts on sleepless nights and written presentations after long flights. The object was not the sum of everything. It was a boundary line drawn in brick and tile. The attempt to strip it from me in a theatrical moment had failed because of the scaffolding I'd built in the quiet hours. Relationships, contracts, alliances, that were invisible to those who never needed them. As Marcus arranged for formal board communication, I found myself composing the next moves I would take in life, now that the immediate crisis had a legal and reputational structure to walk through. There would be meetings and emails and the grind of governance. There would be messy family conversations, perhaps legal consultation, perhaps apologies, perhaps an awkward silence that never mends. I couldn't promise what would happen. Neither could Marcus. But we had opened a door that turned private violence into a matter taken seriously by the institutions that could act. That night, as more viewers watched the clip and commentators debated the morality of my mother's actions, I made a decision that would shape the rest of my life. I would not let my relatives define my worth. I would not allow a single public spectacle to erase the work that had put me where I was. And I would use whatever legitimate, measured tools were available to protect what I had built. It's an odd thing to claim a secret project as an actual program. It sounds dramatic. In truth, my secret project was less glamorous. A decade of meticulous career choices, careful contracts that preserved a degree of autonomy, loyalty repaid with competence. It looked nothing like a plan hatched in a basement. It looked like regular, boring prudence. But when the family's theater of entitlement met a world that keeps records and has shareholders who value stability, that quiet prudence became a kind of power. The town was paying attention. The clip had become a lens. The people who had come to the wedding to witness a family ritual were now part of a larger audience that would judge and document and perhaps act. That night, the town's gossip had the weight of potential corporate consequence. I walked up to the penthouse that week with Marcus at my shoulder for part of it, and alone for part. I stood at the window and watched the river reflect a different kind of light. The penthouse was my proof, a thing purchased and maintained, a quiet rebellion against the idea that I would always be a footnote. Still, owning a place doesn't immunize you from pain. You can own property and still be hurt by those closest to you. The difference is that ownership allows you to draw a line that the world has to respect, not just the family. I don't know how many times I answered the same question over the next 48 hours. Are you okay? People asked it like a test. Some intended kindness, some intended curiosity. My answer shifted depending on who asked. To my colleagues, I was measured. To friends, I was honest. To the cameras, I was pragmatic. To myself, in the quiet, I allowed grief, anger, and a fierce little spark of clarity. That clarity would be important, because the next moves would not be small and quiet. They would ripple beyond the family, into retainer agreements and client calls and boardroom conversations where morality and risk calculus collide. I didn't relish being the nexus. I relished the possibility that one act of making a boundary could remind a town that dignity is not a currency you trade for applause. When the board meeting was called, the invitations read like formal rain: neutral, procedural, inevitable. People I had worked with across 3 regions offered support in the language professionals use. If there's anything you need, or we'll stand by the governance process. Those words mattered. They meant that my decision to assert a boundary had been seen as reasonable in spaces where the bottom line has to account for human error. But there was one thing I couldn't predict. The live stream had already floated beyond our small city. It had a pace and a life of its own. Reputational winds shift strangely. A family whip of drama becomes a headline that loses nuance and gains verdict. The town that thought to shame me on the dais was about to see what happens when an instrument of family theater collides with corporate structure and a mentor who knows how to point out the fiscal consequences. I thought about the charity work I'd been considering, about the women's shelter in the next borough that needed funds and practical support. On the plane rides home 5 years ago, between presentations and hotel breakfasts, I'd bookmarked their website on my phone and promised myself I'd donate when the timing was right. Maybe timing is never perfect. Maybe timing is a collection of windows and doors you decide to walk through. I resolved then, standing before the river, that whatever had to come next, reparations, apologies, imposition, would not be about revenge. It would be about redirecting the energy and resources that had been misused by my family into something that actually repaired harm. When Marcus placed the last call and told me to sleep, because the board meeting would be organized the next day, I felt a curious exhaustion that was mingled with a strange sense of relief. I had been visible, I had been targeted, and I had chosen to activate the structures I'd quietly built. I had not sought spectacle, but I had used what I had to make consequences proportional. The town was shifting, its gossip channels and corporate calls aligning into a current that could not be turned back by a family's apology written on a napkin. My mother would continue to insist on her narrative. My father would learn, in the slow, unpleasant way boards teach, that personal theater can be costly. My sister would live with the ripple effects of choosing spectacle over support. And I would move forward, not with spite, but with a resolve that had, for a long time, been quietly forming. I locked my door to the penthouse and looked at the city. The secret project was no longer secret. It had been revealed as not a single dramatic mechanism, but as the combination of relationships, contracts, and the patience of a woman who had spent years constructing a life independent of the approval of people who'd never offered much of it. Outside, the town was talking. Inside, I held the earring as if it were a talisman, and I let the river, steady and indifferent, remind me that life keeps flowing. The next morning would bring the board's notice, the first of many formal things. The live stream would be edited into clips and stitched into commentary. People would choose sides. The work would not be done, but the boundary was drawn. And in a city where people are always hungry for a public collapse, I had learned a different currency: quiet, methodical defense. It wasn't the flashiest form of power. It was the sort that changes the conversation. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and made a list of the humane things I would do when this settled. Donate a meaningful portion of any compensation to the women's shelter, hire security at my building, cut off certain lines of contact, and invest more in the people who had shown up for me without calculations. I wrote it in a notebook I had kept since grad school, the same one where I'd scrawled ideas for elevator speeches and crisis strategies. The ink looked sensible. It felt honest. When morning came, it brought email notifications and messages from colleagues and a headline that had already taken the 5-second clip and given it the gravity of a movement. My phone buzzed with 1,000 small judgments. Some were supportive, some were thinly veiled critiques, some were offers to help that came without strings. That difference would matter in the months to come. I stood at my window and watched the town spin itself into new narratives. Some would be cruel, some would be merciful, some would be indifferent. I had chosen a different path than spectacle. I had used a quiet lever to protect my life and my property. The next steps would be procedural and messy, but the first move had been made, and that was enough for now. The board meeting wasn't theatrical. It was fluorescent lights and spreadsheets and people who had learned to speak in the precise, cool dialect of risk. They were careful about the words they used. Exposure. Governance. Client confidence. Those words have teeth, even when uttered in a room full of bankers and counsel with their shoes on and their watches set to quarter-hour increments. Marcus sat at the head of the table and let the room reach a consensus on procedure before he put my name on the agenda. When they got there, he didn't linger on the melodrama. He laid out facts: an incident at a public event, a viral clip circulating on feeds, a potential reputational impact for Hayes Capital. He said plainly that the board needed to treat the episode as a governance issue because the conduct of a founder's family could materially affect client relationships and investor confidence. No one promised miracles. No one offered a magician's solution. There were options and contingencies and a calendar of next steps. The language was deliberate because the action it could precipitate wasn't theatrical either. Client calls, internal reviews, PR advisories. It was the quotidian machinery of institutions, and institutions care about continuity. They act to preserve it. In the 2 weeks that followed, the town did what towns do in the digital age. It parsed the clip and assigned narratives to it. There were think pieces that debated family dynamics, commentators who argued about the price of independence, and a trending thread where strangers weighed in on whether mothers are ever justified in shaming daughters. Some users defended Carol with an almost ritual fervor. Others offered me a steady stream of private messages thanking me for standing up. The volume was strange. The opinions were stranger. But the real moves were quieter and farther reaching. A few long-standing clients expressed concern to Marcus and to the board that the optics could be problematic for their own reputations. A retainer renewal was put on pause pending a governance check. One of the firm's major institutional partners requested a formal briefing on whether family conduct could bleed into corporate risk. I don't know the exact dollar figures, or rather, I'm not here to give you assurances about specific legal remedies, but I knew enough to understand the gravity of the shift. When clients begin to call your company's stability into question, senior leadership pays attention in a way they rarely do for private family drama. There was a cascade of practical responses. The board asked for an independent review of governance practices concerning family engagement. Hayes Capital's communications team drafted a statement that did not defend violence, but framed the event as a family matter temporarily under review pending internal governance checks. My father issued a statement that, in the language of corporate PR, amounted to a forced apology, regret for the incident, and a promise that the firm would review its internal culture and policies. It was stiff and legalistic and deliberately minimal. For many outside the firm, it read as contrition. For others who knew my mother, it read like damage control. Carol, my mother, declined to apologize. Not publicly. Not in the language that placated the paper or the PR release. Behind closed doors, she grumbled about being misunderstood, about family values, about teaching lessons. When people in our circle suggested counseling, she scoffed. When board members spoke in neutral tones about behavior unbecoming of someone representing a stewarded company, she rolled her eyes and retreated into righteousness. That posture, in time, would cost her something the family had always valued: deference. It cost her the ability to have the rest of us unquestioningly take her story at face value. It cost her the softness that comes with a private apology when one recognizes harm. Her refusal to soften did more than fracture the family narrative. It hardened the case for those who had to decide whether the founder's private life was leaking into a professional arena, and, if so, how to respond. Sophia reacted to the fallout the way most golden children do, with confusion. At first, she defended our mother, claiming this was a misunderstanding or an emotional moment, Then, as weeks turned into months and the microclimate of the town turned cold for her marriage, friends and acquaintances rearranged their schedules and some neighbors avoided shared events, she began to see the cost of joining the spectacle. Brian, who had been the affable center of their social circle, found that some of his professional contacts were suddenly reluctant to appear with him at industry mixers. It was an odd spiral. Marriage and optics and the business of appearances all tangled in one another. A month later, Sophia left. Not dramatically, no public pronouncements, but quietly, with the sort of sorrow that insists on understatement. She filed for divorce in the small bureaucratic way couples do when the private scaffolding they've been leaning on no longer supports both of them. People who had once laughed at the family's good times now murmured about sad inevitability. I don't say this with relish. I say it because the aftermath of public spectacle is rarely limited to the people you see on camera. It spreads, in unpredictable ways, to lives that trusted the status quo. The board's response, meanwhile, became the thing that would, in time, make the town reassess the narrative they'd been handed. Not because the board was vengeful, but because boards respond to the things that endanger continuity. They asked for a formal reprimand of any family member whose behavior had demonstrable risks to the company. They required an internal governance workshop. They scheduled a town hall-style update for clients who wanted assurances. In the end, corporate caution and investor nerves did what family arguments seldom could. They created a real cost for personal spectacle. Because of Marcus's quick framing and the board's attention, Hayes Capital's leadership approached me with something both surprising and oddly pragmatic: a formal recognition of the role I'd played that night, an offer to elevate my responsibilities, to ensure my voice had a seat where governance and people issues were discussed. There was a conversation about titles that I'm not interested in parsing here. Titles are labels and sometimes fetishes. What mattered was that this was recognition, not the hollow kind that plays well at dinner parties, but the kind that comes with authority and responsibility. I accepted, not for the title or the optics, though both are sometimes helpful. I accepted because the seat gave me the ability to shape the way the firm managed contact between founders and family, to put in place clearer boundaries so that no one else would be put in a position where family theatrics could threaten livelihoods. It was a choice to take a pain point and try to make it less probable for others. With the promotion came a raise, formal responsibility for a team I respected, and a small increase in my decision-making authority. I took the raise and made a decision that surprised even me. I directed a significant portion of it to the women's shelter I'd been thinking of for years. No fanfare, no publicized "look at my generosity" posts. Just an allocation made with the quiet satisfaction of someone who wanted the resources to go where they mattered without becoming a spectacle. That donation didn't undo anything. It didn't erase the slap or the betrayal or the collagen of family history that would take years, if ever, to settle. But it did redirect energy. I put the money into practical support, emergency housing vouchers, counseling hours, and a program that helped survivors find legal aid without judgment. The shelter used the funds to expand an outreach program that reached women who literally slept on different sides of the river from my penthouse. Women whose small tragedies are serious and private and deserve resources without spectacle. Around that same time, I also made a few practical changes to my life. I hired additional security for the building and started using an alias for deliveries. I changed the locks on certain boxes and gave only a small circle of people access to the floor plans and contractor contacts. I blocked certain family numbers. They didn't like it. They framed it as coldness. I framed it as safety. There is a difference. At work, people who'd watched the clip had opinions. Some whispered that I had used corporate leverage to get even. Others told me privately that I'd been measured and brave, that they admired my refusal to give the last word to humiliation. Marcus remained steady. He commended my restraint and then moved on to the next item on the agenda. That was his pattern. Notice the thing, fix the liver, get the company back to doing the work it was founded to do. There were casualties. A few of my father's closest friends, the ones who'd once advised him over scotch, grew distant. The firm's social calendar thinned in ways he hadn't anticipated. There were awkward dinners. There were ellipses where introductions used to be. The town's gossip caravans moved on to new entertainment as they always do. Yet in the quiet, in the workrooms and the client halls, the consequences were tangible. A pause on a major partnership, a delayed expansion plan, tougher board scrutiny. I don't claim credit for those reactions as if they were divine retribution. I only note that when personal conduct crosses into public space, institutions sometimes move to protect themselves. That's not revenge, that's risk management. My parents' marriage continued in its brittle way. My father, for all his earlier charm and capacity to soften party narratives, did something I didn't expect. He sought counseling. Not because he wanted to be seen as a better man in public, but because he realized, when the firm he had helped build stood askew in the wake of the spectacle, that he had to address his part in the family's story. He called me months later from a therapist's waiting room. His voice was younger than it had been in years, stripped of the practiced levity he used as a shield. "I'm trying," he said. "It's messy." "I know," I replied, "and it will be." Carol never softened in the way many observers wanted. She remained, to outsiders and to those who knew her well, largely unrepentant. She offered the occasional sentence that might pass in a small-town paper as contrition. "I regret how things unfolded," was the kind of phrase she could produce when prodded on a press day. But private apologies, those small, intimate words that land with weight, didn't come. She continued to speak of lessons and boundaries with the tone of someone who presumed her version of the moral ledger was absolute. It was an unfortunate outcome for the family that loved ceremony more than truth. Sophia and I spoke eventually, not at the length of the past we've both tried to forget, nor with the bright candor of sisters who had always been close, but in the wary language of two people trying to rebuild a relationship on different terms. We talked about pain. We talked about the way loyalty sometimes looks like complicity. She apologized for not having stepped between our mother and me. Her apology was small, but it was real. It didn't fix everything, and it didn't erase the way she had chosen to stand by spectacle that night. But it was a start. And the town? It changed in small ways. People who had been quick to assume the narrative of family entitlements found themselves watching a larger story. A woman who had quietly built things, a mentor who understood leverage, a board that insisted on governance when private conduct threatened public continuity. The clip that had started as gossip became, in some circles, a case study about the intersection of private life and public trust. That is partly because of the internet's tendency to create focus, where once there was anecdote, and partly because institutions had an incentive to treat domestic spectacle as more than a soap opera. There were rewards, too. Not the brittle sort, but the kinds that matter in the long arc of a working life. Respect from colleagues who'd watched me hold my ground, offers to mentor young female leaders, invitations to sit on panels about governance and boundaries. My work gained a new dimension, helping to design policies that protected employees whose private lives might intersect with company stability. It was ironic. I'd spent a decade learning how not to let my family define me, and now I was helping other firms design structures that would help protect people from similar intrusions. I hired a small team of people I trusted, an assortment of colleagues and friends who, over the years, had shown up for deliverables and for small acts of humanity. We called ourselves, half in jest, a chosen family. We ate dinners that were low-key and honest. We celebrated birthdays without the orchestrated fanfare my family loved. We took turns supporting one another through hospital visits and good book recommendations. It was less glamorous than my penthouse and more sustaining. James, the doorman, became one of my quiet allies, not because he wanted anything from me. He had a steady job and a worldview shaped by decades of watching human dramas unfold in the hotel lobby. But because he had the kind of practical loyalty that matters. He remembered details, he would accept no grandiosity, and he kept my keys when I misplaced them. He once handed me a note a week after the wedding. It read, in his careful, neat handwriting, "You were brave in a way that didn't need noise. I wanted you to know someone saw it." There were nights I still had to remind myself that dignity doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like getting out of bed and going to work. Sometimes it looks like paying your taxes on time and making lunch for yourself and answering your email like an adult. Those things felt trivial then, but they are the architecture of stability. A curious thing happened 6 months later. One of the clients who had paused a renewal, an institutional partner whose logo hangs in the lobbies of 3 continents, re-engaged with Hayes Capital. The reason was less about me personally, and more about the firm's capacity to demonstrate governance. It had cleaned up some policies, drafted clearer rules for family engagement, and shown it could manage reputational risk. I'm not saying this to take credit. Organization, prudence, and the work of many people, people who care about institutions, contributed. But it was a lesson. When private spectacle meets institutional rigor, institutions tend to act to preserve themselves, and that action can, in a roundabout way, vindicate the person who refused to be erased. People asked inevitably whether the slap would haunt me. The answer is both yes and no. In certain rooms, family reunions, old friend circles, it will always be a memory that lingers with the roughness of a bruise. In other rooms, boardrooms and mentorship cohorts, it became, for some, a story of resolve. The bruise healed physically. The emotional scab took longer. I learned slowly to measure my responses and to guard my peace without becoming a hermit. There were moments of ordinary humanity that mattered more than headlines. A neighbor dropped off a loaf of banana bread one weekend with a note. "Saw the thing. Call if you want to talk." A junior colleague I barely knew sent me a message that said, "I watched how you handled it. Thank you for showing us one way to be." Those small messages stitched me back together in ways that public commentary could not. As for my parents, the public apology my father issued, careful, corporate, and forced, was enough for some people and insufficient for others. It catalyzed a few small conversations at home, therapy sessions, long dinners that ended in tears instead of canned laughter. It didn't make my mother more cognizant or penitent. It made her more certain, in her private narration, that she'd been justified. That was a disappointing truth to accept. Families are not always capable of the reparations we want. Sometimes we must make them elsewhere. The town kept talking, but its winds moved on. New gossip replaced the old, yet there was a stronger undercurrent left behind. A slight nudge toward the idea that private actions can have institutional consequences, and that sometimes being visible and refusing to be humiliated can change the calculus of more than one household. I want to be clear about a few things. First, none of this was inevitable. My mother's actions did not guarantee the chain of events that followed. Rather, they created a catalyst that, because of the structures and people I'd cultivated, could be addressed in meaningful ways. Second, using corporate leverage is not a universal solution for private wrongs. It is, at best, a tool to manage particular intersections between private conduct and public consequence. Third, the satisfaction I felt was not the coarse thrill of revenge. It was the quiet confirmation that the life I'd built, slowly, deliberately, wasn't worthless simply because people at a family table had decided to reassign my belongings for the sake of a dramatic photo. There were smaller, quieter outcomes that mattered to me more than the headlines. My promotion made it possible for me to set up a counseling fund within Hayes for employees dealing with family-related trauma. I pushed for clearer policies about family involvement in company events. I ensured that our human resources teams had better training for managing situations where private behavior risks becoming public and affecting colleagues. Those were small, bureaucratic changes that, over time, might protect someone else from an arbitrary humiliation. The women's shelter used my donation the way I'd hoped. They started a pilot program that connected survivors to legal clinics and job preparation workshops. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, an awkwardly cheerful affair attended by people who preferred low-key philanthropy, I stood in the back and let others speak. I didn't want to make the moment about me. But later, a woman came up with tears in her eyes and said, "You made this possible." She didn't know how much I had agonized before sending the wire. She didn't know the nights I'd spent wondering if giving would feel performative. That moment was enough. I kept some lines closed. I did not respond to all pleas for reconciliation. I selectively decided who would have access to me and on what terms. That is an ongoing work, the same way relationships are. Messy, imperfect, and sometimes merciful. People change or don't. The only promise I could make was to be consistent. Not vindictive, not numb, but clear. The penthouse remained mine. I slept there, and sometimes, late at night, I would stand at the windows and look at the city stitched together with lights. The river hummed on, and the next morning would come, carrying with it small obligations and the rhythm of work. That cadence steadied me more than any PR statement. As months turned into a year, people occasionally asked if I regretted anything. Did I regret the visibility? The answer was complicated. I regretted the slap. I regretted the fact that my sister's marriage ended partly because of it. I regretted that my mother couldn't see the harm she'd done. But I didn't regret refusing to surrender what I had worked for. I didn't regret choosing to protect my life and my dignity in a way that used the institutions at my disposal without weaponizing them for vanity. There is a simple arithmetic to dignity that I learned the hard way. You can either trade your peace for the illusion of family approval, or you can preserve your peace by investing in structures that make you safer. That investment is not glamorous. It is paperwork, relationships, quiet mentorships, and making uncomfortable decisions about who gets access to you. It is the dull, steady project of safeguarding a life. Sometimes people will frame such choices in stark moral binaries, family first, career first, but real life rarely fits such neat boxes. For me, the choice was about integrity. My penthouse was not a symbol of selfishness. It was the result of years of labor and small, disciplined choices. Allowing it to be declared another's because of a social ritual would have been to accept a version of myself I had refused for decades. Invisible, maligned, a prop in someone else's happy ending. It's been 3 years since the wedding. My father still calls sometimes. We talk about practical things, taxes, the state of the firm's offices, who will chair which committees. We do not talk much about the night that changed everything. My mother has become someone I no longer expect to apologize, though I sometimes daydream about a small, private human exchange where she sees the harm she caused and chooses differently. It hasn't happened. People change or they do not. Sophia and I have found and lost our rhythms more than once. We are not the kind of sisters who pick up the phone daily, but we have created a line of communication that is honest when it matters. She sometimes brings her daughter to the penthouse for pancakes, and I watch her hands as she teaches a small person how to pour syrup without making a mess. Those moments feel ordinary and holy. The town, our city of acquaintances, our professional networks, our small, watchful neighbors, changed in the way cities do when an example ripples through them. Some people took my side. Some kept walking. Some learned to be more cautious about how they treated other people's boundaries at family events. None of that was absolute, but it was enough. What I want people to take from this is simple. Boundaries matter, and building the capacity to enforce them is not always dramatic. Sometimes it's legal contingency and mentorship and quiet relationships. Sometimes it's the number of people who will pick up the phone at 2 a.m. Sometimes it's a community of colleagues and friends who will be your chosen family when the original one fractures in public view. People asked me later whether I regret being visible. The truth is, visibility is a mixed currency. It opens doors and exposes wounds. It also creates accountability. I used the visibility not as a vanity project, but as a way to insist that my work, my life, was not a prop. And when the town, in its appetite for spectacle, tried to reframe my story, the networks I'd quietly built made it possible for consequences to follow that were proportional and structural rather than petty. If there's a lesson I carry forward, it's this. Dignity is a practice, not an event. It requires you to do the unglamorous things, build relationships, save prudently, insist on contracts that respect your agency. It requires you to select allies and to be willing to let institutions do what institutions do when private conduct threatens public trust. When someone asked me recently whether I was Team Madison or Team Family, I found myself smiling because it was a false choice. One can be devoted to chosen family, friends, colleagues, partners, without being consumed by the need for familial approval. One can insist on boundaries and still love imperfectly. My life now leans toward the people who show up without calculation. Marcus, who will always be more than a mentor. James, who will always be a practical friend. A small staff who work alongside me with affection and professional rigor. They are my chosen family, and they have shown me that belonging can be carefully curated without rancor. I cannot promise that anyone who faces something similar will have Marcus in their contacts or Hayes Capital at their back. I cannot promise that legal or corporate consequences will always follow a public act of humiliation. Consequences depend on context, relationships, and institutions. What I can say is that building capacity, professional, personal, relational, matters. It matters more than the optics of a wedding speech. It matters more than a family's attempt to rewrite someone else's life because they want a better photograph. So if you're thinking about boundaries today, start with the small things. Save. Build relationships that are reciprocal. Keep people in your life who show up without calculation. And know that sometimes the most powerful project you can build is one that no one notices until you need it. Before I go, are you Team Madison, or do you think family should always come first? Comment below with your story. Or just say Team Madison if my refusal to be a prop mattered to you. Share if this helped you think about your own boundaries.